Hi, everyone. This is Linda Lettieri, the math consultant teacher over at Montgomery Elementary. And today I thought we would take a look at a very nice tool that is out on the internet, currently free for use. One never knows how long it will stay that way, called the Fraction Fiddle tool. I think that this will specifically be a fun tool for parents of third grade students to look at. And that is what this video will be about. So here we are taking a look at the Fraction Fiddle tool. It can be located at this web address right here. So if you want to take a moment and pause the video while you jot that down, you'll be able to get to it and use it on your own. And it has lots of directions in case looking at this briefly with me is not enough for you to fully remember all the things that it can bring to your home. So let's get in and take a look. It starts off with asking if you've used this tool before, and I'll put no so that you can see what's offered for those going in for the first time. It goes in and gives you specific directions on how to use the tools, what buttons to use, and how to use them. But as I'm going to show you how to do a lot of this, I'm going to come out of it and get started. So it begins with allowing you to put in a fraction. It starts out with the values 1 over 1 equaling one whole thing. And then you and your child can manipulate what fractions you want to look at. What I like best about this, especially for third grade students, is it uses the visual of one whole thing as a fraction bar, but then also interprets each fraction by showing it as a point on the number line. And then you can use a combination of these visuals, which I will show you. So, for example, I can take a look at the fraction 1/2. I can tell it to please build 1/2, and the fraction bar will come down closer to the number line. This is a really nice way to show the fraction 1/2 and allow for conversations about 1/2 on the number line. I can see that this distance, shaded distance of 1/2 on the fraction bar, aligns with 1/2 of one whole on the number line. So let me just take that one again. When you're looking at a fraction bar, you think of 1/2 as being half of the bar shaded. But when you're thinking about 1/2 on a number line, and this is new to students in third grade, you're thinking instead about distances from 0 on the number line. That is a very new idea to our third grade students. So this itself, this point on the number line, is not in and of itself 1/2 of anything. The idea is that this distance of 1/2 from 0, that's where the 1/2 of one whole thing comes in. From 0 to 1, that distance is one whole unit. And so the distance from 0 to 1/2 is when a half is represented on a number line. Combining it the way the Fraction Fiddle tool does with that image of 1/2 above it and the one whole fraction bar above, ending above the 1 on the number line, I think that really helps students think about why that 1/2 is placed where it is on the number line. Now, the tool itself allows for a second fraction to be put out here, and I think that this is where its strength really comes in as a fun thing to play around with and a fun way to talk about fractions with your student, and even to kind of think about what fractions on a number line mean for ourselves, since we often didn't delve into these concepts in our school days. So one of the things I like to do at first is to come back to the first fraction. And I think in order to do that, I do have to put a second fraction in here and then tell it I want to change a fraction. So excuse me while I play around here just for a minute. I may have to build it first. All right, I will build this fraction. And now what I'm going to do over here is change my original fraction. I like to think about these things in terms of one whole. So one of the ways I like to play with this tool and talk to students about fractions is to represent one whole, whether I do it in 3/3, or whether I do it in 2/2, or whether I simply start out by doing it back the way the fraction tool started out, with one whole thing, just 1/1. I can choose build for this one whole thing and keep that image there as sort of a comparison for students to see alongside the different plottings on this number line. So again, some of what I like to be able to look at here is that set of two different visuals representing fractions. Above it, I can now see what 1/2 looks like compared to one whole thing. And the number line right below it, I can see the alignment of things and reconsider that distance from 0 with some nice solid colors up here, sort of filling in that space. So here is, again, 1/2, but now I have it also visually related very directly to one whole thing by using both fractions that this tool allows. Once we finish thinking about things conceptually, and actually let's do a little more of that. So instead of thinking of 1/2, I can go ahead and change my second fraction. And again, I like for a while to be leaving that first fraction at one whole just for comparative sake. I can take a look and say that I want to think about how thirds are different than halves. I can bring down this third instead, and I can now take a look at how 1/3 would be defined as far as a fraction bar goes. It's created 3 equal parts for me. All 3 equal parts would be equivalent to one whole, but when it's 1/3, it's shaded. And then if I want to think a little more about thirds in general, I can come back to that second fraction, change it using these arrows to 2/3. Take a look how that is different both on the number line and in the shape. All right, I still have 3 whole parts, but now 2 of them are shaded. And look at that distance from 0 I now have. And look how this representation on a number line is different. When I'm thinking about it in terms of a fraction bar, I have 1/3 and 1/3 making 2/3. When I think about it on a number line, though, I actually notate it with a changed numerator or the changed top number, showing the number of units from 0. So 1/3, but then the next label is in fact 2/3. I don't keep writing 1/3 the way that I would for just showing the different unit sizes when I'm using fraction bars. I would probably continue along because a lot of students really do get confused about the fact that there are many ways to represent one whole thing. So I would come along to the second fraction again, and this time I would go ahead and do 3/3 and bring that down to see how representing one whole thing as simply one whole thing with no equal parts divided on top of the fraction bar is the same value and yet different than having 3/3 over here, represented by that same one whole altogether, but divided into 3 equal parts. And then I would take a look at it again on this number line and look at those distances from 0. My distance from 0 is now exactly the same as one whole thing. But because I'm thinking of thirds, the number line has been divided into equal parts where 3 equal parts make one whole thing. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. There's so much to discuss for students who are just starting to think about fractions themselves, just the underlying concept of fractions, and then also translating how to show them on a number line. Students in 3rd grade are also introduced to the fact that fractions don't have to be equal to one whole thing at most, but that we can also represent fractions that are more than one whole thing. I add another third, so another same-sized piece, what I'm doing is thinking about one whole thing and 1/3 of a second whole thing. This is also beautifully shown by this tool. And I can now see that comparison to one whole thing. If I have 4/3, I actually have more than one whole thing. This very clearly shows on the bars that I have one whole thing and another third. And it nicely shows how the distance continues to increase on the number line. I'm another third, further away from 0. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3 was when I was exactly on one whole, and now 4/3, even further away from 0 than one whole thing. This tool is also great for comparing fractions. I can now, after my student has a real anchoring to various fractions compared to one whole, I can begin to think about fractions as compared to each other. Oftentimes in 3rd grade, we start that by just thinking about what we call unit fractions, or fractions that just represent one of a particular fractional unit. So for example, I might start out playing around with fractions such as, what's greater, 1/2 or 1/3? Oftentimes, students will think to themselves, if they are still caught up thinking about the denominator as being a whole number, rather than representing parts or the amount something is cut up into, a lot of times they will want to tell you that 1/3 is the greater number because 3 is greater than 2. The fraction tool here allows visually for them to see why that is not the case, both in blocks and on the number line. So I can put in 1/2 on one side and 1/3 on the other side, and we can really take a look at, with our children, with our students, we can really take a look at, with 2 different visuals, why 1/3 is actually smaller than 1/2. 1/3, I can see, has the same whole, the same sized whole, cut into 3 equal parts. 1/2 is only cut into 2 equal parts, and therefore 1/3 having more pieces that the one whole was cut up into, 1/3 is a smaller piece. Because 1/3 is smaller, it's also going to be closer to 0 on the number line. And we can talk about the fact that when we split one whole into 2 equal parts, one part ending where that 1/2 is above, 2 parts, that's going to take it further away from 0 than when we cut that same distance into 3 parts. 1/3, stopping where the 1/3 of the whole block is above, so we can visualize where 2/3 would be, and then 3/3 being one whole thing. So I thought you would like to take a look at this tool and perhaps bring it up for yourself at home and play around with it. I will tell you that it uses Adobe Flash, which for some reason, computers at least that I've been using tend to have a default block on. And there's been talk about it not being supported for much longer, but for now it works. Sometimes you will have to go up to, when you get to the site, where you'll see a little lock, and go into where it says Flash. Mine had a default that had said block, and what I needed to do was use the down arrow to move it to allow, and then reload it once. It's worth, in my opinion, the time to reload this and give it a try. I think your student will love playing around with it. I think it will lead to a lot of wonderful math conversations at your home. And I hope that you are able to successfully download it and enjoy it with your student. So thank you for joining me on this walk through the fraction fiddle tool. As always, I invite you, I encourage you to reach out and get in touch with any questions that you may have. You can contact me at my Valley Central email address, linda.lettieri, Lettieri, at vcsdny.org, or you may contact your elementary school's math consultant to talk more about fractions and fractions on a number line, as well as how our curriculum addresses fractions on a number line in third grade. Here, my hope is we are increasing the conversations around math in our district, and I hope that this will be a fun way for you to think about fractions more at home. Thank you so much for joining me.